Alright, so welcome to part 3. So for this part, I more or less just want to talk about some of the things that folks had questions about from recitation, and then also some of the hiccups that I was seeing in the paper, which makes me concerned that there's a misunderstanding of some of the concepts. So let's take a quick look at the concept of pre-implantation selection. And let's contrast that with genetic enhancement. Let's see, what did I call that in the last one? I think I had a gene therapy. So let's contrast these two cases, but let's take a look at pre-implantation selection first. So with pre-implantation selection, you have a group of potential embryos. Let's call it embryo 1, embryo 2, embryo 3, and embryo 4. Now let's say that we discover that embryo 2 has a disability trait of some sort, that embryo 4 has a disability trait of some sort, and that embryo 3 has a predisposition for, let's say, asthma. And let's say that embryo 1 doesn't have anything positively, but it doesn't have disability traits or the trait that is likely to lead to asthma. According to Savulescu, the embryo that we should pick via pre-implantation selection is embryo 1. However, here's where things got a little bit tricky in class. In class, one of the things that I was hearing was choosing to make that child deaf is wrong. So let's assume for the sake of argument that this disability that we're talking about is deafness. One of the things that I heard a number of folks say is that it would be wrong for the deaf parents to choose to make that child deaf. But here's the thing. We're not talking about the same potential children. Notice that all these embryos are distinct embryos. None of them are the same. And let's say that we had embryo 2. So let's pull embryo 2 out for a second. Embryo 2 has two potential life trajectories right now. Either not born, so either the embryo will never be implanted and will never be born, or will turn into a deaf child. Notice that these two life trajectories, none of them include becoming a hearing child. So let me say that one more time. None of the potential life trajectories of an embryo that has the genetic predisposition for deafness includes being a hearing child right now. Now, I am ignoring cochlear implants and I am ignoring the potential for gene therapy because that's not what the conversation was about. And yet a number of folks were acting as if the deaf people or the deaf parents were doing something wrong because they were deafening and choosing to deafen a child. But they're not choosing to deafen a child. They will have very distinct children. Because here is the trajectory of embryo 1. So embryo 1, remember, is the one that doesn't have anything positive but doesn't have any of the negative stuff. Embryo 1 will either not be born or will be born as a hearing child. Now, there are some complications here. Maybe something would happen along the way, blah, 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 but we're setting all of that aside. Notice that these life trajectories, none of them include becoming a deaf child. So, the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we think of what it means for deaf parents to choose to have a deaf child, for folks that want to critique that or say that they are wrong to do that, you have to be critiquing the correct thing. It is incorrect to say that the deaf children or the deaf parents are deafening their child. Their child, if the child would be deaf, either will be deaf or not born at all, and the child, if it would be hearing, would either not be born or it would be born hearing. We're not taking, say, here's an infant We're not taking an infant and then going, to deafen or not. That would be a very distinct case, because that's taking a infant that can hear and then forcing them to not be hearing. Now, where this gets complicated is with gene therapy. And this is why I think that maybe folks were actually thinking of gene therapy, or at least I hope that they were thinking of gene therapy. With gene therapy, it would be the case that we have all these embryos. So I'm just going to stick here, but I'm going to hop over to use yellow. So with gene therapy, we would have all these embryos, but we would be able to edit certain things to make them no longer there. Now I'm editing with yellow, so let's say that we also edited this down for some reason and made E1 worse. Or by worse, I mean just the same as everybody else. So actually we could just say that we just didn't do anything to E1, it's just that now all of them are the same. So with gene therapy, yes, it would be possible in theory to make all the potentially deaf embryos have the predisposition for hearing, to get rid of the predisposition for asthma for embryo 3, and then embryo 1 is just no longer any better than any of the others. And that would change these life trajectories, because then we would be able to add in a third trajectory here. Hearing and deafness. However, for the most part, that's not really what the conversation was supposed to be about on Friday. And these things are very different and distinctly different from one another. So I would just ask that folks be very careful when they're arguing about certain things to make sure that what they're doing is accurate with respect to the concepts that we're using. Because if there's a different concept that you're latching onto, then that's where we're going to run into some hiccups. Now, one of the other questions that I got a lot of feedback on was about, let's start over, the non-identity problem. Now, Savulescu actually talks about this. He talks about this with Parfit, if I can spell Parfit's name correctly. So the non-identity problem is, in this case, we had, let's call this a nuclear reactor. This is a nuclear reactor. And then people now, here's a herd of people. They have the choice. Either they can build the nuclear reactor, or they can choose not to build the reactor. And in Parfit's like reasoning, like there's a reason that they build the reactor or that the reactor explodes or whatever. So let's say that they chose to build the reactor. And down the road, they had some children. And these children are sick from radiation poisoning and have problems. So let's underline them in red. The question of the non-identity problem is whether or not there's been a moral wrong to these beings by building the reactor. The non-identity problem says, well, these beings would not have existed unless the reactor had been built, because, let's face it, conception is a fairly robustly finite thing. Who it is exactly that gets conceived can be changed catastrophically by just small tweaks, or in this case, major tweaks, because I think the idea is that then the nuclear reactor like broke and spilled out sludge or something. So in this case, even though these beings have quote-unquote problematic lives, it doesn't seem that they've really been harmed per se by the building of the nuclear reactor, because they wouldn't have existed otherwise if the reactor hadn't been built. We can imagine that there are instead these beings, and that these do not equal one another, that they are distinct beings. All right. There are other YouTube videos that explain this. I think that actually one of my friends made a YouTube video for, it's called Wi-Fi, Wireless Philosophy. I would recommend going and watch it. But how does this relate to our conversation? Well, it relates to our initial picture up here. So for the deaf child, for example, sometimes folks will say, well, it's a wrong to the deaf child to be brought into existence given that they won't have as good of a life as other potential children. And this seems problematic, at least according to the non-identity type of reasoning, since it's not as if that child could have been born otherwise than with the deafness. The only other options, unless we grant gene therapy, are to not be born at all and to have a different child born. So that's how it relates. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I was going to do in this video. I think that was about it. So one of the things that I have done is I've put up a discussion board on Canvas, and I'm going to send out the link, and that includes some initial prompts for folks to talk about with respect to Robertson and some other things that we didn't get to talk about in class, since we had to talk about the papers, and then we spent a lot of time in the other class repairing and sharing on the first prompt. So I would say be on the lookout for the discussion board, and you're going to get the email about the discussion board before you see this video. So that's all I got for this one. The goal was to show the distinction between pre-implantation selection and gene therapy, since conflating the two is a bad idea, and also give folks an overview of the non-identity problem, since it is relevant. Savulescu does talk about it, and some folks might find it interesting. But if you're just confused by all of it, then to be honest, you can also just ignore the entire conversation.